Stay tuned. Welcome to this Exponential Race to the Top session on new financial models to exponentially grow climate solutions and net zero value chains. Lots of big words in that one. So let me unravel a little bit. Exponential Roadmap Initiative is founded around the Exponential Roadmap report that in 2018 found we can actually have emissions by 2030 through scaling, exponentially scaling solutions. Since then, 2018, we've done lots of work, and part of that work consists in trying to take down to the product and services level this definition of what actually is a climate solution, and also to the level of a company, what makes a company a climate solutions company, and then on net zero value chain. So these are value chains or systems that link up companies delivering products and services that meet the needs of all of us on the planet, but while staying within the carbon budget and the planetary boundaries. So we'll discuss this in a little bit more detail, or well, let's rather say we won't discuss in more detail what climate solutions are or what net zero value chains are, but we will discuss how to finance them. And with that, I'd like to welcome Mattias Frumerie, the head of the UNFCCC, head of Swedish UNFCCC delegation and Sweden's climate ambassador. Welcome, Mattias. Welcome, Benedict Libanda, CEO of Namibia's Environmental Investment Fund, Nazmeera Moola, Chief Sustainability Officer at 91, an investment asset manager. And we also have Otto Gernandt, the Chief Financial Officer of H2 Green Steel. Welcome, everyone. Everyone can hear us, so that's, I'm assuming. Otto, we already heard from your colleague, from Johan, a little bit, how you'll produce steel that will have 95% less emissions than the steel that we have today. We heard also how you started from scratch with this company, and we heard a little bit about how this finance came together. Obviously, huge investments needed. You're the Chief Financial Officer, so tell us in a little bit more detail, how did you manage to pull in the finance that was necessary to get H2 Green Steel off the ground?
Hi, thank you for having us again. So it's been 4 years since we started, more or less, today, and we've concluded now a financing of $7 billion, or just above $7 billion, which I think has obviously been challenging, but I think where we very early on, what we realized was the need for project finance, so the need to really debt finance what we were building. The traditional sort of startup financing obviously does not include debt financing in its sort of the suite of products that's available to you for natural reasons. You don't have a balance sheet, you don't have annual reports to show, you have no revenues, you have no cash generation, and so on. So setting out 4 years ago, we really intended and we designed and we built a company specifically to be able to be financed. And I think that is what was key to us. And what it sits and it's based on many different pillars, but the first one and the critical one was the ability to secure offtakes. And I think when you look at the really unique parts of this financing, one of them is the fact that you have, for the first time, long-term contracts with customers that are committing to what we call hard take or pay. So it essentially means a volume commitment and a buy commitment for products with no outs. You have no ability to leave these contracts as long as we supply the products that you have intended to buy, with one very specific element: you are paying a green premium. So there's a lot of talk today about green premiums, and there has been, but we have then sort of legally binding commitments And the unique part is that the product is exactly the same. It's a brown steel coil, green steel coil. It's the same quality, it's the same physical properties, etc. But the green steel coil, people are willing to pay a premium for, and they're willing to sign, in our case, 7-year contracts for that. And that is really, really unique. And that is what sort of we built upon to then create the full financing package for the plant.
Thanks, Otto. Nazmeera, you're at a asset management firm. You're based in South Africa. You have a focus on emerging economies. Can you see a similar case of a similar company, like similar to H2 Green Steel, happening in the emerging economies? So the case where a company like that pulls together finance like that.
I think it's more challenging for several reasons. So as a starting point, one of the things that had underpinned H2 Green Steel, aside from the super important offtake agreements that we've just discussed, was a grant from the European Innovation Fund. And that sort of capital is not available for most emerging market countries. We're seeing some nascent signs come through in some of the larger economies at this point in time, but it's not the quantum that you're seeing available in developed markets. What you've generally seen is the fiscal space in the average emerging economy is much more constrained. Emerging countries don't have the luxury of responding to crises like COVID by effectively printing money, as we saw in Europe and the US. And therefore, as they deal with the climate transition, they are having to fund at higher interest rates, and they are not able to subsidize their local industries in the same way. Having said that, what is within their control, where you're seeing some countries do much better than others, is put in place supportive regulatory environments. And I think that that's where countries need to increasingly focus, is if you are going to try and encourage the more green industries, you have to make it super easy to get renewables built out and removing all of the internal regulatory blocks around that. And I think that's the area in terms of renewable energy build that we have seen the most progress to date. So it's now slowly starting to get to the point where in some of the larger economies, you're talking about more industrial projects. And I think aside from China, which is its own case study and is the largest investor in clean tech globally at this point, but in the emerging space, India is probably furthest along.
Thanks, Nazmeera. I'd like to turn to Benedict now, CEO of the Environmental and Investment Fund in Namibia. So green steel that Otto's company is set to produce, green steel needs green hydrogen, and that's something that you're looking to develop in Namibia. You've set up the SDG Namibia Fund 1. Thank you. I got confused on one and fund, but that's the one that you set up. And the word there is blended finance. How are you trying to make green hydrogen happen for Namibia?
Yes, thank you. I think the narrations from the previous speakers resonates very well with our experiences in Namibia. Now, when we talk about green hydrogen, it requires a large ticket size of investments. Just to give you a context, we do have a pipeline of $20 billion project under the SDG number 1, and that is 2 times our GDP as a country. So you can imagine on how to attract different sorts of capital towards financing such assets. As a public institution, again, touching on Nazmeera's comment, is that we are so constrained with our physical. So the challenges of debt to GDP are extremely, high, and there's a lot of, competing priorities for investment in our space as a country. So we came up with this blended financing platform with a view to really attract different sorts of capital, targeting concessional capital, mainly from donors, and also use public, seed capital to de-risk and attract private investments. So this is how the genesis of SDG number 1, came into place. Then we partnered with the climate fund managers from Netherlands, and in that partnership, which was conceived as government-to-government, relationship between the Netherlands, the Dutch government, as well as the government, we formed that partnership. And this fund has now been seeded with about 40 million euros from Invest International, as well as we're about to close another 60 million euros for the development fund. So it's a blended financing structure where we have a development fund, which is more for de-risking, which is 100 million US dollars. Then we are working on a construction fund, which is more for commercial investors, as well as an operational fund, which is more for fixed income investors. All these kind of funds have got different risk appetites, depending on investors, investors' choices. So where we are at the moment, we've established fund managers to manage the SDG number 1, which is called Namibia Hydrogen Fund Managers. Again, this is a partnership with the climate fund managers and the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia. We have already made some investment decisions at early stage. We have invested in a high iron project in Namibia, more on green steel. We've also invested in Hyphen, triggering 24% equity on behalf of the state. That's about 23 million US dollars at development phase. We're also investing in a feasibility study for a pipeline between Namibia and South Africa. We're working with our counterparts in South Africa. They've also got a blended financing structure called the South African Green Hydrogen Fund.
Matthias, you are negotiating on the hot potato topic in these climate negotiations on finance. And of course, there is this commitment under the Paris Agreement that all finance flows should be compatible with the goals of the Paris Agreement, should go to low carbon development. When you hear stories like these, of blended finance, but also of lots of finance coming together partly through offtake agreements, does that sort of go into the right direction of what people don't yet quite know what they mean by making all finance flows compatible with low carbon development?
Indeed, I think these are really great examples. I mean, both what we heard from HC Green Steel and what Benedict was just sort of portraying in terms of what's being done in Namibia really points to what you're saying, that this is 2.1c in practice.
The Article
Paris Agreement,
the
Article 2.1c in practice.
Yes.
And let me also say that I think over the past couple of years, we've seen a development in terms of the conversation on finance within the UNFCCC context. I mean, from being very much focused on the kind of finance that we as developed countries are providing to developing countries in terms of supporting their climate action, and of course the 100 billion being sort of the pillar of that. But also then moving towards seeing, for example, the commitment or the call we had at COP27 to the multilateral development banks to reform their business models to be able to provide the kind of finance needed for the transition. And now becoming more and more engaged also in this, in the implementation of Article 2.1c and what that actually means for countries. And I think what also we heard previously here, that the importance of a regulatory environment to attract the kind of investment necessary, which goes for all countries, for Sweden, for Namibia, for South Africa. We all need to make sure that we have that kind of attractive investment climate to secure the investments necessary for the transition that we're doing. And I think that's a welcome development within the UNFCCC context, sort of moving from that singular focus on the kind of finance that we as developed countries provide to having that conversation on the wider financial flows and how we ensure that those are moving towards implementation of both the temperature goal and the resilience goal in the Paris Agreement. And of course, not everything is within the mandate of the UNFCCC itself. I mean, much of this is going on outside the UNFCCC. What we can do here is, of course, provide that kind of platform and overview to highlight all these various channels which are becoming increasingly available for countries globally to accelerate their transition.
Thank you, Matthias. Otto, one of the things that we want to talk about is climate solutions, but also funding value chains. And that's where your off-takers play a role. Can you explain that a little bit further? How does that work, this idea that entire value chains transform, and through the finance that they're putting towards a climate solution, transform the entire value chain? So essentially, what role, more specifically, did your off-takers play?
Yeah, I think where the value chain is the big, well, there are two big changes that come from our offtakes, specifically if you talk about the offtakes. One thing is the buying behavior of the customer. So in the traditional steel industry, at least in Europe, you have never had long-term binding volume commitments. You've had long-standing relationships with your preferred suppliers on the steel side, but you have really negotiated on a quarterly basis or an annual basis, and you've retained a lot of flexibility as a customer. You've been buying really a commodity. I think now that we are shifting from brown steel to green steel, you have a very supply-constrained product in the green steel space. You have a product with some kind of differentiation against the rest of the market. And so we've been able to create a different balance between buyer and seller in that sense. And that's what's unlocked and enabled these types of longer-term offtake contracts. And so that's a changed buying behavior, which also changes our business model as a steel company, you could say, in having that sort of revenue visibility, volume visibility, and also ability to production plan for a much longer period of time than a traditional steel plant. Then when you look sort of more sort of upstream in the value chain, I think where the value chain is changing is more tied to what it means to produce a green steel product. And in essence, steel is a very, very energy intense industry. And the vast majority of that energy today is provided by coal. And so in decarbonizing the steel industry, you have to shift from that source of coal to a source of renewable electricity generation, basically. And the change in the value chain there on the upstream side is simply that you need to relocate, in this case, the iron production part of the value chain, what is today a blast furnace, to locations where you have access to cheaper renewable electricity. Because that becomes the driver and that becomes the differentiating part. And so if you are a traditional steel plant, you're located, based on a logic of having access to coal, you're maybe next to a coal mine or you're next to a port where you can get access to coal, then that's been the big driver for you. I will make one other quick comment, I think, on the offtake side, tying back to sort of, when you think about it from a developed market standpoint, or developing market standpoint. So the subsidy part in our financing is very, very small. It's significantly less than 10% of the total funding need if you combine all types of sort of grant-related funding sources that we have. But I think what the bigger hurdle is in putting this together somewhere else will be the offtake side. So how do you think about, let's take South Africa as an example, building a green steel plant in South Africa, securing the willingness to pay for that green product, securing that premium, long-term offtakes, and that sort of revenue side, it will be more challenging. And where I think customers and the private actors can play a bigger role is to allow us to disconnect, the abatement or the saved green tons, the green element from the steel production from the brown element of the steel production, to essentially then market and sell certificates, because a ton of CO2 saved in South Africa is as much valuable as a ton of CO2 saved in Sweden. So to be able to sell certificates, maybe on one hand, and then to sell a cheaper product in the domestic market where maybe there is no willingness to pay for green. I think that would be a very powerful tool that the private market can provide, basically, to unlock more financing in developing markets.
Thank you, Otto, for that reflection. Benedict, I was going to ask you something else, but do you have any thoughts on what Otto just said there?
Yes. I think it's interesting what Otto is doing in Sweden. We're also looking at how to really unlock certain income generation streams for these green hydrogen projects that we are developing. One of the areas we're looking at is from the carbon market perspective, looking at green premiums and green attributes. So we have just concluded a study with the assistance of the World Bank, also working with McKinsey, on the potential of expanding, revenue generation streams for these projects, so that they get to realize their feasibility. And I think it holds certain potential. Although it is at early stage, lots need to be unlocked. There's some hurdles to overcome. One of the approach we're undertaking is again government to government, discussions. Our offtake process of these goods and services that we are putting on the market are being led between bilateral discussion between the government of Netherlands and Namibia, Germany, Japan, and South Korea. So these, are some innovation that we're trying to bring on the fore and see how we can close the much needed financing gap that is required.
And there's a fair bit of value chain thinking going on there as well, right? Because you're not only focusing on the green hydrogen production, but you have much bigger plans.
Oh, most definitely, because what we're taking advantage of is that Namibia could potentially produce green hydrogen at a low cost of capital because of our endowed natural resource of radiation and wind speed. But most importantly, green hydrogen is not an end to itself. We are taking that advantage to transform our economy as a country and also diversify our economy into a low carbon economy using the renewable energy resources as a conduit to our economic development. So we're looking at creating, much needed jobs in the country from green hydrogen constructions and development. We're looking at, closing the Gini coefficient of the country. We're looking at, expanding the physical revenue of the ministry, etc. So it's really not merely production to only assist the global north to decarbonize, but also to transform and benefit the countries.
Talk about race to the top and seizing opportunities, right?
Yes.
That's how you see it.
Yeah.
Nazmeera, as a private investor, you need to deliver a return, right, to your investors. So at what point can you come in when it comes to financing these kind of solutions and really value chain transformations? And in which markets?
So I think it depends on the mandate. So we are an asset manager. All the capital we manage is on behalf of our clients, and it depends on the mandate they provide us. So we have developmental funds with anchor investment from various European Union governments that allow us to fund infrastructure across the African continent, which would be very interested in some of the earlier stage funding. We tend to operate on the debt side rather than the equity side, but there are funds that will do the same on the equity. They struggle to get to the size that Benedict is talking about because these are very large projects now, whereas these sort of more developmental funds have been set up to do smaller projects or to do the larger projects in conjunction with many others. I think the challenge right now is how do we get broad-based developed market private capital interested in investing in emerging markets? Because we've spent the last 2 or 3 years talking about the importance of it. Earlier on in this discussion, there was a mention of the increasing refocus of the development finance institutions and the MDBs that are now trying to facilitate this flow a lot more. But the reality is the average developed market pension fund or insurer has very little interest in investing in projects in emerging markets. And how do we begin to bridge that gap? And that's why Otto's example of creating alternate revenue streams, I think, is very important. I think some de-risking at fund level from the MDBs and the DFIs are potentially quite important because part of the problem is just a lack of familiarity. There is a big part of it that is higher risk, but there's also an even bigger part of it that's higher perceived risk versus realized risk. The IFC's GEMS database, our own experience investing across many of these markets is that realized risks are a lot lower than expected. So how do we get more investors into the space to increase their familiarity and therefore have this experience firsthand?
What are your reflections on that, Mattias? You were nodding.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a very good point in terms of the familiarity of the markets. I mean, if we just look at the Swedish or European investors and where their capital flows are directed, I mean, it's mainly within those markets they already know. And so I think that there is definitely work to be done in terms of increasing the awareness of the potential of markets globally for making these kinds of investments. And of course, it goes both ways in that sense. I mean, how can investors from, for example, European countries raise their own awareness, and how can countries like South Africa and Namibia also be part of raising that awareness? So, how do we make those sort of two ends meet in that sense? Maybe that's not for the UNFCCC to do. There are other fora where that could be done more efficiently, but I would definitely think that that is something, an area to work on, which would in the end also benefit the work that we're doing here, because there is increasing certainty that the investments will be flowing, that the finance is there for these kind of projects, to support the kind of transition that countries are doing globally.
But another way for countries, for national governments to accelerate the transition to low carbon technologies is to put an effective price on carbon.
Absolutely.
Which is something that
phasing out fossil fuel subsidies.
Exactly.
But of course also setting, I mean, now since we're in the era of new NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, having all countries globally to come forward, and especially the G20 countries coming forward with new ambitious NDCs, also setting that kind of bar in terms of what is it that we as a country want to achieve, and how can we sort of convince investors that this is an achievable goal, and also how investors and various types of companies, across the sectors of the economy can also make that point that, these are projects which are doable. We can, as you're doing in Exponential Roadmap, saying that the solutions are out there, the finance is there. It's just, we need to make sure that all of these various strands in terms of policy development, finance, and technology are coming together to ensure that these investments are actually flowing.
But how have countries been reflecting this? Well, really, it was a commitment to put money into low carbon technologies. So, and then there's been this really loud call from the UN Secretary General to please put a price on carbon and phase out fossil fuel subsidies and all this. So that's a tall order. How have countries been reflecting that here in Bonn?
Not sufficiently, I guess, is the easy answer to that. But there are also, again, other platforms where that conversation is maybe have had more in operational terms. We have, for example, the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, which comprises some 70 or 80 countries already now, where one of the strands there is discussing carbon pricing. And I think we have some 60, 70 countries globally who have introduced some kind of carbon price. That obviously needs to increase, we would say, at least from a Swedish perspective, because it actually helps pricing the sort of the externalities of how you're dealing with your transition to net zero.
I would have one last question, since we need to wrap up this question, that we go back to the exponential race to the top. Where, from all your different perspectives, where are you seeing that in countries, in regions, in companies, in cities? Where's that competitive spirit that you see when from the financing perspective, right? Not the development, but really from the financing perspective. I'm betting on a solution that's going to win the new economy. Where are you guys seeing that?
I think we saw good examples here. I mean, both from H2 Green Steel and from Namibia.
I think from where we sit, we see the offtake mechanisms to be one of the best, avenues to unlock investments. If we can establish the pricing of green hydrogen within the next two years or so, and secure those offtakes, that will give impetus and investors confidence And from an investment and fundraising perspective, and participation of pension funds, as several asset managers, that will be a good call to the market.
Nazmeera, Otto, any thoughts?
I think two things. On the one side, I'm most excited when I look across emerging markets, whether that's Latin America or Asia or South Africa, Namibia to some extent, but Namibia is more coordinated. Benedict and James and the team there have done an amazing job in coordinating it. But across emerging markets, I'm most excited by what private companies are doing, because in many countries you see companies acting ahead of their governments because the governments are reluctant to make overly ambitious pledges. And so companies that face the global markets, that sell into Europe or face global financial institutions, are taking ambitious action. The fastest growth in SBTI sign up and verification over the last couple of years, certainly in percentage terms, has been in India. And the country's NDC is 2070. So that excites me. The other thing, which is more recent, is I have finally started to see DFIs start to talk about adjusting their business model and start to do something. And it's not translated into a floodgate of money as yet, but it's a whole lot further than it was 2 years ago. So that's in its early stages, but both of those things, corporates putting their balance sheets to work and DFIs starting to take some positive steps.
Thank you, Nazmeera. Otto, what movement are you seeing that's exciting you?
I think, first of all, we're very proud to have been able to put the whole thing together. And I think people view it as a sort of a positive signal that you can put together a very, very largely privately funded climate project today, and a large-scale one. It's possible. It's not easy, but in a way, it should not be easy to raise $7 billion either. So I kind of I feel like we've seen a big change. We've been continuously fundraising over 3.5 years. I think the biggest thing we are missing right now, I think if you properly structure a project, if you really piece together the technology, construction contracts, the infrastructure, the offtakes, the team that's going to execute it, and so on. If you properly put that together and structure it, you will have senior funding available. You will have export credit agencies available providing credit guarantees. I think on the equity side, I would still like to see a widening of mandates. I think that's where we are lacking participation from certain actors, because let's say certain equity funds or pension funds or whatever it may be, they do not take construction risk. They do not invest pre-revenue. They do not invest, whatever it may be. And I think here, and you hear that even from climate-focused funds, surprisingly enough. And I think if you want to be a climate investor and you really want to drive climate change and climate action through your equity fund, you also have to have a mandate where you invest in these types of assets. And I think there we've seen change over 3.5 years, but that is really moving slow, I would say. So if there's anywhere in the capital structure, I think we need to see change. It's there, but otherwise, I think we've seen that it's possible. It's difficult, but it's possible, and it's working. So I'm very happy. And last thing I'd say is from a European perspective, I mean, we're now really seeing the Fit for 55 ambitions being turned into legislation. And so that's also very, very central to our financing, will be very central to other similar type of projects in Europe completing their financing. And I just hope Europe will now continue, which I think we're happy with on the whole, we're happy with the result of the election in Europe, but stay the course, stay true to the Fit for 55 program, and don't waver on it, because that will create uncertainty in the markets.
Thank you, Otto Gernandt of H2 Green Steel. And with that, I'd like to wrap up this session, and thank you to all our other speakers, Nazmeera Moola of 91 Investment, and Benedict Libanda of Namibia's Environmental Investment Fund, and Mattias Frumerie, Sweden's Climate Ambassador. Thank you all for joining today, and stay tuned for our next Exponential Race to the Top session, in which we'll talk about scaling climate solutions coming up just after this short little element.